There's a reason you feel manipulated after certain conversations. Why you agree to things you never intended to. Why you walk away from encounters feeling drained, confused, or somehow smaller than when you arrived. It's not weakness. It's not coincidence. It's psychology being weaponized against you in ways so subtle, so carefully crafted, that you don't even realize you're being played until the game is already over. Most people think manipulation is obvious. They picture the loud, aggressive bully or the obvious con artist. But that's amateur hour. Real psychological manipulation operates in shadows. It whispers instead of shouts. It smiles while it strikes. And the most dangerous part? You'll thank them for it. Today, I'm going to expose the shadow tricks that are being used on you every single day. Not the textbook theories you've heard before, but the real-world psychological weapons that skilled manipulators deploy to control your thoughts, emotions, and decisions without you ever knowing it happened. By the end of this video, you'll see these tactics everywhere. In your workplace, your relationships, your social circles, even in the media you consume. But here's what makes this different from every other video on manipulation you've watched. I'm not just going to tell you what these tricks are. I'm going to show you exactly how they work on your subconscious mind, why they're so effective, and most importantly, how to recognize them the moment they're being used on you. Because once you can see the strings, no one can pull them. The first shadow trick is called emotional hijacking, and it's happening to you more often than you think. Most people believe they make decisions with logic, but psychological research shows that emotions drive 90% of our choices, and logic just comes in afterward to justify what we've already decided to feel. Skilled manipulators know this. They don't argue with your logic. They target your emotions directly. Here's how it works. They create an artificial emotional state in you, then make their request while you're in that heightened condition. The classic example is the charity worker who shows you devastating images of suffering children, waits for that emotional peak, then immediately asks for your credit card. But the shadow version is far more sophisticated. Watch this. Someone approaches you with urgent energy. Their voice is slightly elevated. Their body language suggests crisis. Before they even tell you what they need, your nervous system is already responding to their state. Mirror neurons in your brain automatically sync with their emotional frequency. Now they speak. The request seems reasonable because you're experiencing their urgency as your own emergency. You're not being asked to help. You're being emotionally infected with their need, and your response feels like your own decision, when it's actually an emotional contagion. The most skilled manipulators can shift your emotional state in seconds, make you feel what they want you to feel, then harvest that emotion for compliance. But emotional hijacking is just the surface level. The second shadow trick cuts deeper. It's called reality revision, and it's the reason you sometimes question your own memory, your own perception, your own sanity in certain relationships or situations. Reality revision works by gradually shifting your understanding of what happened, what was said, or what you agreed to. Not through obvious lies, but through subtle reframing that makes you doubt your own experience. The manipulator becomes the narrator of your shared reality, and slowly, you start accepting their version as truth. It begins with small corrections. You remember them saying one thing, they insist they said another. You recall feeling uncomfortable about a decision. They remind you how excited you were. Each individual correction seems minor, not worth fighting over, but collectively, they're rewriting the story of your interactions, making you the unreliable narrator of your own life. The psychological impact is devastating because it attacks your confidence in your own perception. Once you start doubting your memory, your feelings, your judgment, you become dependent on their version of reality. They become your external hard drive for truth, and whoever controls the truth controls the relationship. This isn't just manipulation. It's psychological warfare designed to make you question the very foundation of your own experience. And once that foundation cracks, you'll accept almost anything they tell you because you no longer trust your own mind to distinguish fact from fiction. The third shadow trick is perhaps the most insidious because it feels like friendship. It's called manufactured intimacy, and it's the reason you sometimes find yourself sharing deeply personal information with people you barely know, or feeling unusually close to someone who hasn't actually earned that level of trust. Manufactured intimacy works by artificially accelerating the normal process of relationship building. Instead of trust developing naturally over time through shared experiences and proven reliability, the manipulator uses psychological shortcuts to create the feeling of closeness without the foundation. They do this through strategic vulnerability. They share something personal about themselves, not because they trust you, but because it creates a psychological debt. When someone shares a secret, your brain interprets this as a sign of trust and closeness. The natural response is to reciprocate with your own vulnerability, creating a false sense of mutual intimacy. But here's the trick. Their vulnerability is calculated, often rehearsed, and always designed to make you feel special for being chosen as their confidant. Your vulnerability, however, is real. You're giving them genuine access to your inner world while they're performing a scripted intimacy designed to harvest your secrets. The most skilled practitioners of manufactured intimacy can make you feel like you've known them for years within a single conversation. They mirror your communication style, validate your opinions, and create what feels like an instant connection. But connection requires time, consistency, and mutual investment. What they're creating is the illusion of connection, a psychological hologram that feels real but has no substance. Once they have your trust, your secrets, your emotional investment, the dynamic can shift. The intimacy was never real. It was a tool to gain access to your inner world, and now that access can be used against you. But manufactured intimacy relies on something even darker, which brings us to the fourth shadow trick. This one is called the empathy trap, and it's the reason good people often find themselves being taken advantage of by those who have no intention of reciprocating their kindness. The empathy trap works by weaponizing your natural human capacity for compassion. Manipulators identify empathetic people not to connect with them, but to exploit their emotional responsiveness. They present themselves as victims, as misunderstood, as struggling against circumstances beyond their control. Your empathy responds automatically. You want to help, to understand, to provide the support they seem to desperately need. But here's what you don't realize. Your empathy is being farmed. They're not seeking your help to solve their problems. They're seeking your emotional energy to fuel their manipulation. The most dangerous part of the empathy trap is that it makes you complicit in your own exploitation. You feel good about helping. You feel needed, valued, important. The manipulator feeds this feeling by expressing gratitude, by telling you how much your support means, by making you feel like you're the only one who truly understands them. But notice what never happens. The problems never get solved. The crisis never truly resolves. There's always another emergency, another misunderstanding, another situation where you're the only one who can help. Your empathy becomes their renewable resource, and you become addicted to the feeling of being needed. The empathy trap is particularly effective on people who derive their self-worth from helping others. If your identity is built around being supportive, compassionate, and available, you become an ideal target for those who specialize in creating sophisticated emotional emergencies designed to harvest your care. These four shadow tricks work together in combinations that most people never see coming. Emotional hijacking makes you feel what they want you to feel. Reality revision makes you doubt your own perceptions. Manufactured intimacy makes you trust them with your vulnerabilities. And the empathy trap makes you feel good about giving them whatever they want. But this is just the beginning. There are deeper layers to this psychological manipulation, more sophisticated techniques that operate below the level of conscious awareness. methods that can influence your decisions, alter your beliefs, and reshape your behavior without you ever realizing you're being controlled. The fifth shadow trick operates on a level most people don't even know exists. It's called cognitive anchoring, and it's the reason you sometimes make decisions that seem logical in the moment, but make no sense when you look back at them later. This technique doesn't attack your emotions or your memory. It attacks the very process by which your mind evaluates options and makes choices. Here's how it works. Before presenting you with what they actually want, the manipulator plants a reference point in your mind. Not obviously, not directly, but through casual conversation that seems unrelated to their real agenda. They mention numbers, time frames, or standards that seem random but are carefully chosen to influence your judgment. Let's say someone wants you to commit to a project that will take 6 months of your time. They don't start by asking for 6 months. They start by telling you about someone else who spent 2 years on a similar project. Now, 6 months doesn't sound unreasonable. It sounds like a bargain compared to the anchor they've placed in your mind. But the anchor isn't just about numbers. It's about shifting your entire frame of reference for what's normal, acceptable, or fair. They tell you about someone who was treated far worse than they're treating you. Suddenly, their behavior seems reasonable by comparison. They mention opportunities that required much larger sacrifices. Now their request seems modest. Your brain uses these anchors as shortcuts for evaluation. Instead of judging their request against your own standards, values, or availability, you judge it against the carefully selected reference points they've provided. You think you're making an independent decision, but you're actually making a comparison to benchmarks they've chosen, specifically to make their offer look attractive. The most sophisticated manipulators layer multiple anchors, creating a web of reference points that all support their desired outcome. By the time they make their actual request, your mind has been primed to see it as reasonable, fair, even generous. You're not just saying yes to what they want. You're thanking them for the opportunity. But cognitive anchoring is just one part of a larger psychological assault that brings us to the sixth shadow trick. This one is called the scarcity illusion, and it's designed to bypass your rational decision-making process entirely by triggering your survival instincts. Scarcity illusion works by creating artificial urgency around opportunities, relationships, or resources. The manipulator makes you believe that whatever they're offering is rare, limited, or about to disappear. Your brain, wired for survival, interprets scarcity as danger. The fear of missing out overrides your normal caution and due diligence. But here's the shadow version. They don't just tell you something is scarce, they make you discover it. They let slip information about other people who are interested. They mention deadlines that seem to come from external circumstances, rather than arbitrary decisions. They create the appearance of natural scarcity, while actually manufacturing the entire shortage. The psychological pressure is intense because it feels real. Your nervous system can't distinguish between genuine scarcity and artificial scarcity. The fear response is the same. The urgency feels authentic. And under that pressure, you make decisions you would never make with time to think clearly. The most dangerous aspect of scarcity illusion is that it makes you grateful for the opportunity to be manipulated. You feel lucky to be chosen, special to be given access, fortunate to be included. The manipulator becomes someone doing you a favor rather than someone taking advantage of your psychological vulnerabilities. This connects directly to the seventh shadow trick, which operates on your need for social validation. It's called consensus manufacturing, and it's the reason you sometimes find yourself agreeing with positions you don't actually hold or participating in behaviors that contradict your values. Consensus manufacturing works by creating the illusion that everyone else is already on board with whatever the manipulator is proposing. They don't argue for their position. They simply present it as the obvious choice that reasonable people have already made. Your brain, wired for social survival, interprets disagreement with consensus as dangerous isolation. But the consensus is manufactured. They mention conversations with others that may or may not have happened. They reference agreements that were never actually made. They speak as if decisions have already been reached when they're still being negotiated. Slowly, you begin to feel like the only one who hasn't yet seen the obvious wisdom of their position. The pressure to conform is overwhelming because it feels like social survival. Going against perceived consensus triggers deep psychological alarms about rejection, isolation, and exclusion from the group. Rather than face that discomfort, you align yourself with what appears to be the majority opinion, even when that majority doesn't actually exist. The manipulator becomes the voice of reasonable people everywhere. Disagreeing with them feels like disagreeing with society itself. And once you've accepted their position as the consensus view, questioning it becomes questioning your own judgment and social awareness. These shadow tricks work because they exploit fundamental features of human psychology. Your brain's need to process information quickly, to maintain social connections, to avoid danger, to make sense of complex situations. These aren't weaknesses. They're survival mechanisms that have kept our species alive for millennia. But in the hands of skilled manipulators, these same mechanisms become weapons turned against you. Your strengths become your vulnerabilities. Your wisdom becomes your blindness. Your compassion becomes your exploitation. The eighth and perhaps most devastating shadow trick combines all the others into what can only be described as psychological imprisonment. It's called identity hijacking, and it's the reason some people completely lose themselves in certain relationships or situations, becoming unrecognizable to friends and family who knew them before. Identity hijacking works by gradually replacing your self-concept with a version that serves the manipulator's needs. They don't attack who you are directly. Instead, they offer you an enhanced version of yourself, a more successful, more attractive, more important identity that can only exist in relationship to them. They become the mirror that shows you your best self. Under their influence, you feel more confident, more capable, more valuable than you do in other contexts. This isn't accidental. They're deliberately reflecting back qualities you wish you possessed, making you dependent on their presence to access this enhanced version of yourself. But this enhanced identity comes with conditions. It requires you to adopt their values, their priorities, their version of reality. Slowly, imperceptibly, your authentic self gets buried under layers of manufactured identity that feels more real, more attractive, more successful than who you actually are. The trap is complete when you can no longer access your authentic self without them. Your confidence, your sense of worth, your very identity becomes contingent on their approval and presence. You're not just being manipulated. You're being systematically replaced with a version of yourself that exists solely to serve their agenda. This is the deepest level of psychological control. Not just influencing your decisions or emotions, but actually restructuring your fundamental sense of self. And the most terrifying part is that it feels like growth, like becoming your best self, like finally realizing your true potential. But there's something even darker lurking beneath all these techniques, a master strategy that coordinates and amplifies every other form of manipulation. And once you understand this final piece, you'll see how all these shadow tricks work together to create a level of psychological control that most people can't even imagine exists. The ninth and final shadow trick is the one that orchestrates all the others. It's called the invisible leash, and it's the reason you can know about every manipulation technique in the world and still find yourself trapped by someone who's mastered this art. Because this isn't just about individual tricks anymore. This is about creating a psychological ecosystem where manipulation becomes invisible, automatic, and self-sustaining. The invisible leash works by making you the enforcer of your own control. Instead of constantly manipulating you, they train you to manipulate yourself. They establish patterns, expectations, and internal voices that continue their work even when they're not present. You become your own warden, your own handler, your own psychological prison guard. Here's how it operates. After using all the previous techniques to establish control, they begin withdrawing their active manipulation. But by now, you've internalized their voice. You hear their judgments in your head. You anticipate their reactions before they give them. You modify your behavior based on what you think they would want, even when they haven't asked for anything. The invisible leash is complete when you start policing your own thoughts, emotions, and actions according to standards they've implanted. You censor yourself before they need to censor you. You doubt yourself before they need to create doubt. You control yourself more effectively than they ever could, because the control now feels like your own choice. This is the masterpiece of psychological manipulation, not just influencing someone, but creating a self-sustaining system of control that operates automatically. The manipulator can step back and watch as you do their work for them, believing every restriction you place on yourself is your own wisdom, your own growth, your own mature decision-making. But here's what they don't want you to know. Every single one of these shadow tricks has a fatal weakness. They all depend on your unconscious participation. The moment you become aware of what's happening, the moment you can name the technique being used against you, its power begins to dissolve. Awareness is the antidote to manipulation. Not just intellectual knowledge, but visceral recognition of these patterns as they're happening to you. When you feel your emotions being hijacked, when you notice your reality being revised, when you sense manufactured intimacy or artificial scarcity, you can step back from the psychological battlefield and refuse to play the game. The manipulator's greatest fear is an aware target, someone who can see the strings while they're being pulled, someone who recognizes the performance while it's being staged, someone who understands that their confusion, their compliance, their emotional responses are being deliberately engineered. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you know how these shadow tricks work, you'll spot them everywhere. In conversations, in relationships, in media, in your own internal dialogue, where you've learned to manipulate yourself using techniques others taught you. Your awareness becomes their limitation. Your recognition becomes their failure. Your understanding becomes your freedom. And that's the real secret they don't want you to discover. You were never as powerless as they made you believe. You were just unaware of the game being played. Now you know. Now you can see the shadows where these tricks hide. Now you can recognize the moment someone begins to weaponize psychology against you. And that recognition is the beginning of your immunity to manipulation in all its forms. The shadows only have power in the dark, but you've brought light to places that were meant to stay hidden. And in that light, the shadow tricks lose their magic, their mystery, and their control over your mind. You're no longer an unconscious participant in someone else's psychological game. You're an aware observer who can choose whether to play at all.